On a humid Saturday in late September of 2003, 15-year-old Samantha Torres vanished from the edge of a dusty Texas road, leaving behind a silence that would stretch across 2 decades. She was a girl of quiet promise, her future an unwritten page, taken before the story could truly begin. For 20 years her mother searched, the community whispered, and a cold case file gathered dust in a forgotten cabinet. Then a chance discovery in an abandoned barn, a water-damaged journal hidden within a wall, brought Samantha's voice back from the void. The words she had written as a teenager became the map that finally led detectives to the monster who had been hiding in plain sight, proving that some stories refuse to end until justice writes the final chapter. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Samantha Torres, known to everyone as Sam, was a creature of the Texas Hill Country. She was born to its rhythms, its sweltering summers, and its mild, dusty winters. At 15, she was caught in that delicate space between childhood and whatever came next. She had her mother's dark, thoughtful eyes and her father's quiet resilience. Her hands, though often smudged with graphite from her sketching pencil or dirt from the garden, were gentle with the horses she adored. She was not loud or demanding of attention. Her presence was a steady, calming warmth, like the last rays of an autumn sunset over the fields of their family ranch. The Torres Ranch was 100 acres of rolling land just outside San Marcos, a place where the world felt both immense and intimately small. It was a landscape of live oaks, limestone outcroppings, and the constant buzzing song of cicadas. For Sam, it was the only universe that mattered. She knew the exact spot where the bluebonnets bloomed thickest in the spring and the shallowest crossing in the creek after a hard rain. Her closest companion was an aging quarter horse named Apollo, whose soft muzzle often nudged the back of her head as she sat on the fence, writing in her spiral-bound notebook. That notebook was an extension of her. It was not just a diary for secrets, but a repository for observations. In its pages, she sketched the angular face of a hawk, wrote down snippets of conversations she overheard, and drafted poems about the vast, star-dusted sky. She was an observer by nature, more comfortable watching the world than being at the center of it. Her dreams were simple and clear. She wanted to be a veterinarian, to spend her life healing the animals she understood so well. She spoke of it with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. It was not a question of if, but when. Her room was a sanctuary of her interests. Posters of constellations were pinned to the walls, alongside anatomical charts of horses. Stacks of books leaned precariously on her nightstand, a mix of veterinary textbooks and classic novels. Her desk was a controlled chaos of pens, sketchpads, and half-finished drawings. Everything in the room spoke of a life in progress, of a mind that was curious, gentle, and full of nascent purpose. She was a good student, a dependable daughter, a loyal friend. She was the kind of girl who made the world feel safer simply by being in it. The tragedy of her loss was not just in the life that was taken, but in the countless lives she would have touched, the animals she would have saved, and the quiet goodness she would have spread. The town of San Marcos in 2003 was a place still holding on to its small-town identity, even as the cities of Austin and San Antonio crept closer. It was a community built on handshakes and front porch conversations. People knew their neighbors' children by name and left their doors unlocked without a second thought. The Torres Ranch, situated several miles out of town, was even further removed from the worries of the wider world. The only sounds that broke the afternoon quiet were the lowing of cattle, the distant rumble of a tractor, and the wind rustling through the gnarled branches of the oak trees. The air that September carried the first hints of autumn. The oppressive heat of August had finally broken, leaving behind warm, golden days and cool, clear nights. It was a season of transition, the landscape shifting from vibrant green to shades of ochre and brown. The smell of dry earth and curing hay hung in the air, a scent so familiar it was a part of the local consciousness. It was a place where time seemed to move more slowly, governed by the sun and the seasons rather than the clock. This pervasive sense of safety, of idyllic rural peace, was the backdrop against which the horror would unfold. It made the crime not just shocking, but inconceivable. It felt like a violation of the natural order, a darkness seeping into a world that had, until that day, been defined by light. The last day of Samantha's life began with an ordinary Saturday morning routine. She woke with the sun, the pale light filtering through her window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She pulled on her worn jeans and boots and went out to the barn to feed the horses. Her movements were practiced and efficient, a quiet choreography she had performed thousands of times. Her mother, Maria, watched her from the kitchen window, a cup of coffee warming her hands. It was a scene of such perfect, simple domesticity that it would later feel like a dream. After her chores, Sam came inside for breakfast. She and Maria talked about her plans for the day. She was going to her friend Jessica's house in town to spend the afternoon. They were going to study for a history test and watch movies. It was a plan as simple and innocent as any 15-year-old could make. Around noon, Sam went to her room to get ready. She packed her backpack with her history textbook, a change of clothes, and her journal. She always had her journal. It was her constant companion, the place where she made sense of the world. She came back into the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She gave her mother a quick hug, the familiar scent of hay and soap clinging to her clothes. Maria told her to be home before dark. Sam promised she would. Those were the last words they ever spoke to each other. Sam walked out the front door and down the porch steps, her boots crunching on the gravel of the long driveway. Maria watched her go, a slender figure walking toward the main road a half-mile away, where Jessica was supposed to pick her up. The sun was high in the sky. The world was bright and still. Maria turned back to her kitchen chores, the image of her daughter walking away already fading from her mind, assuming it was just another Saturday. She never came home. The first prickle of unease came late in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Jessica, her voice hesitant and confused. She asked Maria if Sam was still at the house. She said she had been waiting for her, but she never showed up. Maria's heart seized. She explained that Sam had left hours ago, walking down to the road to meet her. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Jessica explained that her car had trouble starting, and she had been running about 30 minutes late. By the time she got to the end of the Torres' driveway, Sam was not there. She had assumed Sam had gotten tired of waiting and walked back to the house. Panic began to set in, a frantic, buzzing energy that made it hard to breathe. Maria called her husband, who was out mending a fence on the far side of the property. He rushed back to the house, his face etched with concern. Together they drove the half-mile stretch of road between their driveway and the main highway. They called her name, their voices thin and desperate against the vast, indifferent landscape. There was no answer. They drove to Jessica's house, then to the homes of other friends, their hope dwindling with every empty driveway. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the fields, the panic solidified into terror. The familiar landscape of their home, the place that had always represented safety and peace, now felt alien and threatening. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep. Every dark shape in the distance looked like a discarded piece of clothing. The world they knew had fractured, and a terrible new reality was beginning to take its place. Just after sunset, with the sky bleeding purple and orange, Maria Torres made the call she never imagined she would have to make. She called the sheriff's department and in a voice trembling with a fear she could barely control, reported her daughter missing. The arrival of the Hays County Sheriff's deputies shattered the rural quiet. The flashing red and blue lights of their patrol cars cut through the deepening twilight, painting the trees and the side of the ranch house in frantic, strobing colors. The deputies were calm and professional, but their presence confirmed the family's worst fears. This was no longer a case of a teenager who had lost track of time. This was a serious matter. A command post was quickly established at the end of the driveway, and the half-mile stretch of road where Sam was last seen became the focal point of an official investigation. Detective Robert Miller was assigned as the lead investigator. He was a veteran detective, a man with 20 years of experience and a weary, methodical approach to his work. He had seen the worst of human nature, but cases involving children always carried a different weight. He arrived at the Torres ranch and was struck by the stillness of the place, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding within the family. He found Maria and her husband sitting at their kitchen table, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Miller's first task was to build a timeline, to retrace every step of Sam's day. He interviewed Maria first, his questions gentle but precise. He listened as she recounted the morning's ordinary events, her voice breaking as she described Sam's final hug. He spoke with Sam's father, who confirmed he had seen her walking down the driveway as he headed out to the pasture. Then he went to speak with Jessica, the friend Sam was supposed to meet. The girl was distraught, overcome with guilt for being late. She swore she never saw Sam. She had driven up and down the road twice before calling the house. There was no sign of her. Miller and his team canvassed the few neighboring properties, but no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces. It was as if Samantha Torres had simply been erased from the landscape. The most troubling detail was the complete lack of evidence. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no tire tracks veering off the road. Her backpack, containing her phone, wallet, and her precious journal, was also gone. Without a crime scene, Miller was fighting a ghost. He had a missing girl, a terrified family, and a vast, empty expanse of Texas countryside that seemed to have swallowed her whole. By the next morning, word of Sam's disappearance had spread through the community like a brush fire. The fear that had taken root in the Torres household now permeated the entire town. This was the kind of thing that happened in other places, on the nightly news, not here. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A volunteer search center was set up at the local community hall. Neighbors, friends, and complete strangers arrived in droves, ready to help in any way they could. The search was a massive undertaking. Teams on foot, guided by grid maps, moved in long lines through fields and dense thickets of mesquite. Men on horseback navigated the rougher terrain along the creek beds. The buzz of ATVs filled the air as volunteers scoured the dirt roads and fence lines. The search was a powerful display of community, solidarity, a collective refusal to accept that a child could simply vanish. Local businesses donated food and water for the searchers. A printing shop ran off thousands of flyers with Sam's smiling face, and soon her image was taped to every storefront window, telephone pole, and gas station pump in the county. The media descended on San Marcos, their news vans lining the road near the Torres ranch. The story of the missing rancher's daughter became a nightly feature on local television, her face a symbol of a community's stolen innocence. Detective Miller directed the official investigation, but he was grateful for the civilian effort. They could cover more ground than his department ever could alone. He focused his team on the procedural work, the less glamorous but essential tasks of law enforcement. They ran background checks on every known sex offender within a 50-mile radius. They interviewed transient workers and checked records at local motels. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued. A handful of tips trickled in. A truck driver called to report seeing a girl matching Sam's description at a rest stop 70 miles away. Miller sent a deputy to check the surveillance footage, but it was too grainy to make a positive identification. Another call came from a woman who remembered seeing an unfamiliar blue pickup truck parked on the side of the road that afternoon, but she could not recall the make, model, or license plate. Each potential lead felt like a spark of hope, but one by one they were extinguished. The truck driver's sighting was a dead end. The blue pickup was never identified. The days bled into a week, and the search area expanded, growing more desperate and less hopeful with each passing day. The initial flurry of activity began to slow, and a grim reality started to settle in. Samantha Torres was gone. The passage of time is a cruel and subtle thief. At first, its movement is marked by frantic activity, days measured in search grids, nights measured in sleepless worry, but soon the rhythm changes. The first week passed, then the first month. The search parties grew smaller, then stopped altogether. The news vans packed up and left, chasing the next breaking story. The flyers with Sam's face began to fade and tear in the sun and rain, her smile slowly dissolving back into the paper it was printed on. Anniversaries became the new markers of time. The first year after her disappearance, the local paper ran a small article, a brief reminder of the girl the town had not been able to find. A candlelight vigil was held at the community hall. Friends and neighbors gathered, their faces etched with a sorrow that had become familiar. Maria Torres stood before them, her voice steady as she thanked them for not forgetting. But as the years continued to pile up, the vigils grew smaller. The world, as it is designed to do, moved on. Friends graduated high school, went to college, got married, and had children of their own. The town grew, new families moved in who had never heard the name Samantha Torres. The case, once a source of urgent communal panic, slowly receded into local folklore, a ghost story told to warn children not to talk to strangers. For the Torres family, hope became a torturous thing. It would flare up with every news report of a Jane Doe being found in a neighboring state, only to be extinguished by a phone call from the coroner's office, confirming it was not her. With each passing year, the odds of finding her alive diminished, yet the absence of answers made it impossible to truly grieve. They were trapped in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward, unable to go back. Sam's room remained exactly as she had left it, a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a life interrupted. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books still sat on the nightstand. It was a shrine to a ghost, a place where hope and despair existed in equal measure. Maria refused to let go, while her husband retreated into the hard physical labor of the ranch, channeling his grief into mending fences and tending to the cattle. Maria's work was the relentless, all-consuming job of remembering. She became a fixture at the sheriff's department, her regular visits a quiet but persistent demand for action. She maintained a website dedicated to Sam's case, posting updates and sharing age-progressed photos. She became an advocate, a voice for the families of the missing. Her personal tragedy transformed into a public mission. But in the quiet moments when the work was done and the house was still, the weight of the unanswered question, "Where is my daughter?" was a crushing, physical presence. Detective Robert Miller carried the Torres case with him long after the initial investigation wound down. Of the hundreds of cases he had worked in his career, this was the one that settled deep in his bones. It was a personal and professional failure that he could never shake. The image of Sam's smiling face on the faded flyer, which he kept pinned to the corkboard above his desk, was a constant reminder of his inability to provide answers to a grieving family. He would periodically reopen the file, rereading his own meticulous notes, hoping to see something he had missed, a new angle, a forgotten detail. but the pages always told the same story. A girl had vanished without a trace. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no evidence. It was a perfect crime, or a perfect tragedy. Years later, even after his retirement, the case followed him. He would sometimes find himself driving the country roads around San Marcos, his car slowing as he passed the turnoff to the Torres ranch. He never stopped. He did not know what he would say. The silence of the case was a chasm between them, a shared space of failure and grief that words could not bridge. The investigator's burden is not just in the search for the guilty, but in the heavy silence left behind when the search comes up empty. For Miller, that silence was the loudest sound he had ever known. The family's limbo was a quiet, unending agony. Life continued, but it was a different kind of life, a grayscale version of what had come before. Holidays were hollow, birthdays were brutal reminders of the years Sam had missed. The joy of family gatherings was always tinged with the sorrow of her absence. Maria and her husband learned to navigate their grief differently, a divergence that sometimes felt like a chasm between them. He found solace in the land, in the tangible work of the ranch. She found purpose in the fight, in keeping Sam's memory alive. Maria's persistence was born of a mother's fierce, primal love. She refused to allow her daughter to become a statistic, a cold case file number. She spoke to reporters on every anniversary, her message always the same: someone knows something. She believed, with an unshakable conviction, that the key to solving the mystery was locked away in someone's memory. She just had to keep knocking on that door until it opened. This unwavering determination became her shield against the crushing weight of despair. It was the one thing she could control in a world that had stolen everything else. For 20 years, she lived in this state of perpetual waiting, holding onto the fragile hope that one day the phone would ring and the silence would finally be broken. In the spring of 2023, 2 decades after Sam Torres disappeared, a woman named Sarah Jenkins bought a small, dilapidated property a few miles from the old Torres ranch. The place had been abandoned for years, the house barely standing and the barn a skeleton of weathered wood. Sarah, an artist who had moved from the city seeking solitude, saw potential in the ruins. She planned to renovate the barn into a studio. The work was slow and grueling. One sweltering afternoon in June, she was in the barn, tearing out old, mouse-eaten insulation from the walls. As she pulled a large section of fiberglass batting away from the wooden studs, a small plastic-wrapped bundle fell to the dusty floor. Curious, she picked it up. The plastic was yellowed and brittle with age, but it had protected its contents surprisingly well. She carefully tore it open. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook. The cover was warped and stained with mildew, the pages swollen and stiff from years of humidity. As she gently pried it open, she saw a name written in a looping teenage scrawl on the inside cover: Samantha Torres. The name was instantly familiar. Sarah had grown up in the area. The story of the missing girl was a piece of local history, a cautionary tale whispered at sleepovers. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone what she had found. She immediately drove to the Hays County Sheriff's Department and handed the notebook over to the front desk deputy, her hands still trembling. The notebook landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, tech-savvy investigator in the county's newly formed cold case unit. Rossi had not been on the force when Sam disappeared, but she knew the case well. It was a legend in the department, a symbol of an intractable mystery. She looked at the fragile, water-damaged journal not as a diary, but as a 20-year-old piece of evidence. She sent it immediately to the forensic lab with specific instructions: preserve every page, but more importantly, analyze the cover, the spine, and the plastic wrapping for any trace of DNA that might have survived the years of heat and neglect. While the lab went to work, Rosie immersed herself in the original case files. She spent days reading through Detective Miller's precise handwritten notes. She saw the initial flurry of activity, the dozens of dead-end leads, and the slow, creeping sense of frustration that filled the margins of his reports. She re-interviewed Sam's parents, who were now in their 60s. Maria Torres, though aged by 2 decades of grief, had the same fire in her eyes that Miller had described in his notes. She spoke of Sam in the present tense, as if she had just stepped out of the room. Rosie also met with the retired Detective Miller, who brought his own unofficial file to their meeting. He walked her through the first 48 hours of the investigation, his memory of the details as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. He spoke of the case with a heavy heart, a man still haunted by the one that got away. The forensic team at the lab performed a painstaking restoration of the journal. Using specialized drying techniques and digital imaging, they managed to make some of the faded ink legible. The early pages were a portrait of a thoughtful, observant teenager. Sam wrote about a difficult math test, a fight with her best friend, and the simple joy of riding Apollo through the open fields at dusk. Her voice was so alive, so present, that Rosie felt as if she were reading over the girl's shoulder. Then, in the last few entries, the tone of the writing shifted. The change was subtle at first, a new thread of unease woven into the fabric of her daily observations. She described a rusty, nondescript pickup truck that she had started seeing parked on the side of the road near her family's property. She wrote that she had seen a man near the fence line just watching. At first, she dismissed it as curiosity, someone admiring the horses, but his presence became more frequent, more unsettling. The final entry, dated the day before she disappeared, was just a few short, chilling sentences. The man from the fence was there again today. He just watches. It makes my skin feel cold. This was the key. This was the piece of the puzzle that had been missing for 20 years. No one in the original investigation had known about the man at the fence line. Samantha had told no one but her journal. The most significant breakthrough came not from the words on the page, but from the object itself. The forensic team managed to isolate a partial DNA profile from skin cells left on the spine of the notebook. The plastic wrapping, while not airtight, had protected it from complete degradation. Rosie ran the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database, but there was no match. In 2003, this would have been the end of the line. But in 2023, Rosie had another tool at her disposal: forensic genetic genealogy. With the family's permission, the partial profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database. A team of specialists began the laborious process of building a family tree from the distant genetic relatives who appeared as matches. For weeks, they worked backward, tracing lineages, cross-referencing public records, and slowly narrowing down the possibilities. Finally, they arrived at a single promising candidate, a man named Frank Miller. He was no relation to the retired detective, a coincidence that felt like a cruel joke of fate. Records showed that in 2003, Frank Miller, then in his late 30s, had lived in a rented trailer on a property that bordered the back acreage of the Torres ranch. He had worked as a long-haul truck driver and had a minor criminal record for theft, but nothing violent. He had moved away less than a year after Sam's disappearance. Rosie and her team located Frank Miller living in a small town in Oklahoma. He was now in his late 50s, still driving a truck, living a quiet, unremarkable life. Before they could confront him, they needed to confirm the DNA match. They put him under surveillance. For 2 days, a team of undercover officers followed him on his route. The opportunity came at a roadside diner. They watched as Miller finished his coffee and tossed the disposable cup into a trash can on his way out. An officer retrieved the cup, and it was sent immediately to the lab. The results came back less than 24 hours later. The DNA from the coffee cup was a perfect match to the unknown profile found on Samantha Torres's journal. They had found the man from the fence line. The confrontation was quiet and anticlimactic. Two detectives from Rossi's team, accompanied by local Oklahoma police, knocked on the door of Frank Miller's small, tidy house. He answered, a balding man with tired eyes and a slight paunch. He was initially calm, almost bored as they explained who they were. He denied knowing anything about a missing girl from Texas. He claimed he barely remembered his time living there. His composure was a wall of practiced indifference. The detectives took him to the local police station for questioning. In a small, sterile interrogation room, the conversation went in circles for hours. Miller denied, deflected, and claimed a faulty memory. Then Detective Rossi, who had flown in for the interview, slid a single photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution image of the journal's cover, the name Samantha Torres clearly visible. Miller's eyes fixed on the photograph, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his carefully constructed facade. A flicker of recognition, of fear crossed his face. He knew what it was. Over the next several hours, the story came tumbling out. He confessed in a flat, emotionless voice, the horrific details delivered with a chilling matter-of-factness. He had seen Sam riding her horse near the fence line and had become obsessed. He watched her for weeks, fantasizing about her. On that Saturday, he saw her walking down the long driveway. He pulled over and offered her a ride, telling her a fabricated story about seeing her friend's car broken down a few miles up the road. Sam, a trusting girl from a safe community, hesitated but eventually got in his truck. He did not take her to her friend. He took her to the abandoned barn, a place he sometimes used as a workshop to repair his truck. He said he kept the journal as a trophy, a secret reminder of what he had done. He had wrapped it in plastic and hidden it deep inside the wall, never imagining it would ever be found. The final piece of the puzzle was the most devastating. After the confession, Frank Miller agreed to show them where he had buried Samantha's body. He led a team of detectives and forensic anthropologists to a remote, desolate piece of land he had once leased for hunting. There, under the shade of a solitary twisted oak tree, he pointed to a spot on the ground. After hours of careful excavation, the search team found human remains. Dental records would later confirm what they already knew in their hearts. After 20 years of searching and waiting, Samantha Torres had finally been found. The evidence recovered from the shallow grave corroborated every detail of Miller's confession. The monster who had lived as a ghost for 2 decades now had a name and a face. The news of Frank Miller's arrest sent a tremor through the San Marcos community. It was a story that reopened old wounds, bringing a flood of memories back to the surface. People who were teenagers when Sam vanished, now parents themselves, felt a renewed sense of fear and a profound sadness for the girl they had grown up with, even if they had not known her personally. The arrest was the lead story on every local news channel. Photos of Frank Miller's tired, unremarkable face were juxtaposed with the bright, smiling image of 15-year-old Sam. The contrast was jarring. The monster was not a shadowy figure from a nightmare. He was an ordinary man who had lived among them. The relief that washed over the town was palpable, but it was a heavy, somber relief, weighted with the knowledge of the 2 decades of pain the Torres family had endured. The most difficult task fell to Detective Rossi. She and the sheriff drove out to the Torres ranch, the same long gravel driveway Sam had walked down on her final day. They found Maria Torres in her garden, her hands covered in dirt. She looked up as they approached, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. They sat with her and her husband in the same kitchen where they had first spoken to Detective Miller 20 years before. Rossi spoke gently, her voice filled with a compassion that went beyond professional duty. She told them about the journal, about the DNA, about the arrest. And then, in the quiet of the afternoon, she told them that they had found Sam. The news was not a moment of triumph. It was the confirmation of a nightmare, the end of a long and agonizing period of uncertainty, replaced by a brutal and horrific certainty. The final fragile thread of hope that Sam might one day walk back down that driveway was severed forever. Maria wept, a deep, shuddering grief that came from a place of profound exhaustion. It was the sound of a 20-year vigil finally coming to an end. Later, Rossi gave her the journal, now carefully preserved in an evidence container. Maria held it in her hands, her fingers tracing the outline of her daughter's name. She was holding her daughter's last words, a final, heartbreaking message sent across an impossible distance. Faced with an airtight case, the DNA evidence, the journal, the confession, and the recovery of the body, Frank Miller's legal options were limited. To avoid a lengthy trial and the possibility of the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to kidnapping and murder. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair. The courtroom was filled with members of the community, friends of the Torres family, and the retired and active law enforcement officers who had worked the case over the years. Frank Miller stood before the judge, a gray, diminished figure, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The final word belonged to Maria Torres. She stood to give a victim impact statement, her voice clear and strong. She did not speak of hatred or revenge. She spoke of love. She described her daughter, her passion for animals, her quiet kindness, her love of writing. She told the court about the 20 years of holidays with an empty chair, the milestones her daughter never reached, the grandchildren she would never know. Then she looked directly at Frank Miller and told him that while he had taken her daughter's life, he could never extinguish her light. She said that Sam's memory would be a force for good, while his would be nothing more than a footnote in a tragic story. She had refused to let him have the final word. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the community of San Marcos came together to finally mourn the girl they had lost so long ago. A public memorial service was held at a local park. Hundreds of people attended, many of whom had never met Sam but felt as if they knew her. They had searched for her, prayed for her, and carried her story in their hearts for 2 decades. The service was a collective exhalation of grief, a chance for the town to heal the wound that had been open for so long. The old fear that had lingered in the background of their lives began to recede, replaced by a shared story of loss, resilience, and the eventual grinding triumph of justice. Frank Miller was transferred to a maximum security prison deep in the heart of Texas. He disappeared into the anonymity of the penal system, his name and face fading from the public consciousness. He would live out the remainder of his days in a concrete cell, his only legacy the immeasurable pain he had caused. He would grow old and die in obscurity, a ghost in a prison uniform, his existence a stark contrast to the vibrant legacy of the girl whose life he had so callously destroyed. He was a creature of darkness, and in the end, he was consumed by it. Maria Torres, having finally brought her daughter home, channeled her grief into purpose. With the support of her family and an outpouring of donations from the community, she established the Samantha Torres Foundation. The foundation had a dual mission: to provide resources and support for the families of missing children, and to fund creative writing programs for teenagers in rural communities, honoring Sam's love for her journal. The first scholarship was awarded to a young girl from a nearby town who, like Sam, dreamed of being a veterinarian and found solace in writing. Maria had transformed her private agony into a public good, ensuring that her daughter's name would forever be associated with hope and creativity, not with violence and loss. She had built a legacy of light from the deepest darkness. A simple notebook, filled with the private thoughts of a 15-year-old girl, became a voice that a monster could not silence. It lay dormant for 20 years, a hidden testament waiting for its moment to speak. A mother's love, unwavering and relentless, kept that story alive, refusing to let the world forget the daughter she had lost. Justice, when it finally came, was not swift or clean. It was a slow, methodical, and painful process, pieced together from faded ink, microscopic cells, and the enduring power of memory. In the end, the story of Samantha Torres is not about the evil that took her, but about the love that brought her home. It is a reminder that even after the longest, darkest night, the light of a single cherished memory can be enough to illuminate the path to truth.